The dusk lay low over Copper Creek, as if the sky itself were exhaling after a long, weary day, letting its colors spill across the plains in slow-moving currents of gold and bruised violet, and a cold wind chased the dust in little spirals that whispered of hunger and forgotten names. Along the abandoned rail tracks, a young native woman named Nayeli Willowcrest, aged 20, walked with bare feet that ached for miles, each step an apology whispered into the earth for existing at all. Her blanket, thin and frayed, clung to her shoulders like the last remnant of a life she had long since been pushed out of, and yet she kept walking with a trembling determination that felt both fragile and fierce at the same time. The sky deepened around her, and she could smell winter riding on the air, sharp and metallic, warning her that night would not forgive weakness. The lights of a distant ranch flickered like uncertain promises, drawing her forward despite the voice in her chest insisting she was worth nothing and should expect even less, and still she walked toward them with trembling hope, wondering whether someone might see her differently. By the time she reached the edges of Copper Creek town, the streets had thinned, leaving only a few shopkeepers closing up and townspeople murmuring to each other as they drifted home, but the moment they saw her, they stiffened like they'd glimpsed a ghost they wanted no part of. A woman tugged her children away with a tightness in her mouth that stung more than any insult could, and a shopkeeper, his apron dusted with flour, glanced at Nayeli's bare feet, her ragged blanket, and dismissed her with a shake of his head before she even spoke. She tried anyway, voice timid, asking if maybe she could work for scraps, but he turned the sign on his door without looking at her, muttering something about strays bringing trouble. Her stomach growled loudly as if protesting his words, but she wrapped her arms across her middle, feeling the warmth of shame far more sharply than the cold. No matter how softly she asked, doors stayed closed, eyes stayed hard, and voices stayed unkind, and she felt her breath falter as the world pulled itself away from her like she carried a storm no one wanted to stand under. But someone across the street paused in the saddle of his horse, a quiet figure watching her with an expression she couldn't read, and his stillness tugged at her attention like a thread she didn't yet know she needed to follow. He was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered, steady-eyed, sun-browned beneath the tilt of his worn hat, and his posture held a kind of rough gentleness that surprised her even before she knew his name. This was Elias Thorne, age 30, a cowboy known around town for doing his work with a silence that others often mistook for distance, though if they'd ever looked closely, they might have seen the loneliness etched beneath the calm. He watched her not with suspicion but with something like quiet recognition, as if he'd seen hunger before and didn't fear it. Nayeli felt her breath catch, not because she believed he might help, but because she had spent so long preparing for rejection that even a moment of stillness before it felt strange. Her feet moved toward him without permission, driven by desperation more than courage, and she swallowed hard before forcing the words out that felt heavier than the blanket on her back. I'm not worth much, sir," she whispered, her voice breaking like dry reeds under pressure, "but I can cook." For a heartbeat, the wind paused as though waiting for him to judge her like the others, but instead Elias lowered his gaze to her shivering hands and then lifted it with softness rather than doubt, a softness that made her exhale as if she'd been holding her breath for days. He nodded once, slow and steady, and simply said, "Come on." Unsure if she'd misheard or imagined kindness, she followed him anyway, unaware that this moment would shift the entire axis of her life. The ranch sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall grasses that swayed like tired dancers beneath the moon, and as Elias led her to the small cabin by the stables, Nayeli felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest, fear mixed with a strange, fragile safety. He opened the door without ceremony and handed her a blanket that smelled faintly of pine and horses, and the warmth nearly broke her composure. He didn't ask why she was alone or how long she'd been walking. He only said, "You're cold. Sit," in a tone that didn't allow shame any place to hide. She sat on the wooden bench as he set a bowl of stew in front of her, and she stared at it as if it might vanish if she blinked, then ate with quiet gratitude that bordered on disbelief. Elias stepped back, giving her space without withdrawing entirely, and she noticed how he kept glancing her way, not to rush her, but to make sure she didn't feel watched. Later, when he showed her the small spare room where she could sleep, she hesitated at the threshold, wondering if she truly deserved this refuge. His voice, gentle but gruff, broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Get some rest. We'll figure things out in the morning." Something in the way he said warmed her more than the blanket ever could, and she lay down with her heart softening into a calm she wasn't sure she could trust yet, all while a new question trembled beneath her ribs. In the days that followed, Nayeli discovered that Elias kept his promises quietly, steadily, and without expecting anything in return, and the ranch hands, Jesse Pike among them, soon learned to treat her with a growing kindness that surprised her in small doses she didn't know how to accept at first. She cooked meals that warmed the entire cabin, and the men, initially hesitant, found themselves praising her dishes with laughter and gratitude she wasn't used to hearing. She kept the kitchen tidy, fixed torn shirts, gathered herbs, and learned the rhythm of the ranch with the same softness she carried everywhere, and each evening, Elias lingered in the doorway longer than necessary, watching her hands work with a tenderness he didn't yet understand. Their conversations stayed gentle and short, but every day he seemed to find a small reason to speak with her, asking about spices, asking how she slept, asking if she'd eaten enough. Gestures that seemed simple until she realized they were becoming the quiet language of his care. At night, she braided her hair by lantern light, and more than once she felt his gaze land on her gently, like a touch from afar, a touch he was too respectful to turn into anything more. The space between them began to hum with a low, steady warmth neither dared name out loud, and still she felt her heart lean toward him in ways she didn't yet know how to stop, wondering whether he felt that same pull tightening quietly inside himself. That pull grew in ways neither of them intended but neither could avoid, weaving itself through moments that appeared ordinary on the surface but carried the weight of something slowly blooming beneath. One morning, Elias taught her to ride his horse, Bluefire, his calloused hands hovering near her waist without fully touching, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cold breeze. Another evening, she brewed a traditional herb tea for him after he returned from work with sore shoulders, and he drank it with an expression so humbled that she had to look away, afraid her heart might show too much. The ranch became a place where silence spoke louder than words, soft glances across the dinner table, the way their shadows touched before their bodies dared to, the way his voice grew lower whenever he said her name. One night, a nightmare seized her from sleep, pulling her into memories she'd tried to bury, and Elias, passing her door, heard her gasp. He knocked softly and stepped inside, sitting on the floor beside her bed with a patience that soothed more than any words could. She didn't ask him to stay, but he did, quietly leaning his head back against the wall until her trembling faded, and she watched him with wide eyes, realizing how deeply she had begun to trust him. In the dimness of that shared silence, her heart whispered a question she was not brave enough to say aloud, wondering whether something in him was changing too. But outside the sanctuary of the ranch, the world did not soften as they did, and whispers began circling through town like restless crows looking for a place to land. Sheriff Maddox caught sight of Nayeli in the general store buying flour with money Elias had given her, and his expression darkened as though she had disrupted an order he wanted to protect. A day later, he rode to Elias's ranch, dismounted with a heavy thud, and told him point-blank that taking in a stray would upset the townsfolk. Elias, wiping sweat from his brow after mending a fence, fixed the sheriff with a level stare and calmly said, "She's not hurting anyone." Maddox's jaw tightened, muttering warnings about town image and trouble waiting to happen, but Elias stood firm, his posture unmovable as stone. Nayeli overheard the tail end of their conversation and felt a sharp, immediate panic bloom in her chest, the memory of every rejection snapping awake like a wound reopened. She slipped out the back of the cabin, instinct pulling her toward the open fields with the idea of disappearing before she caused more trouble, her breaths coming short and frightened. She didn't hear Elias come after her until his voice cut through the wind, a note of fear she'd never heard from him before, asking where she thought she was going. She froze, trembling, as he approached her slowly, as if afraid she might vanish like a startled doe, and rain clouds rolled overhead in a warning that echoed the storm inside her chest. "You heard them," she whispered, unable to look up. "I bring nothing but trouble. I should leave before I ruin your life." Elias stepped closer, his boots sinking softly into the dampening earth, and he said her name in a tone so gentle it nearly undid her. She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing worry etched across his face, worry for her, not because of her, and the reality of that hit her with a force that left her breathless. Lightning cracked far away, casting a fleeting glow over them, and in its wake, Elias lifted a hand to her cheek but stopped inches away, giving her the choice to close the distance. She leaned into his palm with a trembling sigh. "Stay," he murmured, his voice low, roughened by emotion he hadn't planned to reveal. "If you want to leave someday, that's your choice. But don't you dare run because you think you're not worth something. Not to me." The rain began to fall in soft, cool drops, and Nayeli felt tears blend with the wetness on her skin as Elias's other hand brushed her cheek, his rough thumbs catching the tremble of her breath. Her voice broke as she whispered, "I don't know what I am to you." Elias's forehead lowered to hers, their breaths mingling in the rain, and he answered in a tone barely above a whisper, "More than you think." The kiss they shared then was tender, rain-cooled, trembling with the weight of all their silence, a kiss that sealed something fragile and fierce between them, and yet still left them wondering how to name the depth of what had begun. Their bond grew stronger in the days that followed, steady and quiet, until even the townspeople began to sense the change, though acceptance did not come instantly. But Elias was not the kind of man who cared for whispers, and Nayeli was learning, slowly, to believe that she deserved more than survival. One evening, under a warm sky streaked with orange and rose, Elias took her hand as they stood by the corral and said her name with such reverence that she felt her heart stutter. He spoke carefully, as if crafting each word with his own hands, and asked for her permission not just to love her but to build a life beside her. Her eyes filled with a trembling light as she said yes, and the ceremony that followed was small but deeply honest. Elias in his best shirt, Nayeli in a dress stitched by townsfolk who had begun to see her differently, their hands bound in a blend of Western tradition and her people's custom of honoring unity. When Elias lifted her veil, his touch was tender, reverent, and full of promise, and the kiss they shared sealed a beginning that both soothed and ignited the hearts watching. Their life afterward felt like a soft breath released after years of holding it in, mornings filled with laughter over burnt biscuits, long rides along the riverbanks where her hair streamed behind her like a dark ribbon, evenings spent leaning into each other by firelight as if time itself wanted to pause around them. The town slowly, cautiously, grew to accept the couple whose love had proved stronger than prejudice, and Nayeli found herself moving through her days not as a burden but as a woman deeply cherished. Sometimes she would brush her fingers along Elias's jaw and feel his smile against her palm, and she'd marvel at how life could change with one quiet moment of courage, how warmth could unfold where once there had been only cold. And if you, the one hearing this story now, ever find yourself walking alone through a world that seems unwilling to make space for you, remember the way Nayeli carried her hunger and her shame but still whispered her truth to a stranger. Remember Elias, who saw her worth before she saw it in herself. Life has a way of offering unexpected doors disguised as kindness, and sometimes a single step through them can rewrite everything you believed about your own value. So keep walking, even if every step feels small, because somewhere ahead, perhaps closer than you think, waits a moment that can lift your whole world and invite your heart to stay.